Said, for a very
extensive discussion on the key features of the book. I know there was a lot that he presented, some key ideas about what are the approaches that we should have in mind, the contextualist approach, the linguistic context, the macro context, and the connector context. Talks about how does the contextualist approach value add in how we understand the Qur'an, and importantly, what are the steps that we should have in mind, the approaches that we should have steps that we should have in mind if you want to engage in a contextualized approach. So is this a Q&A session right now? So I will take, let's keep it short. I will take 2 questions.
I think do one by one.
Oh, one by one? Okay, so let's go one by one.
May I ask?
Yes, please.
An example of this contextual approach for one simple ethical legal aspect that tries to look at it in present times.
Okay.
Just one example.
Can I help to suggest the example? But and then I leave doctor to.
I would like to pick an example.
Okay, sure.
Because I think the contextual Prof said that it's more onto the ethical legal and how we are supposed to look at it in present times. So just like one simple example as to how we have to interpret it as it is in the Quran to present day practice.
Okay. See, the ethical legal texts, I went into quite a bit of detail in the book, what they are. The ethical legal texts are the texts or the ayat or the verses that deal with rules and regulations, also deals with the beliefs, practices, deals with halal and haram. And I mentioned that the beliefs and the basic practice like salat and fasting, pilgrimage, and also the very clearly spelled out halal and haram are not really, they're not subject to reinterpretation and the like. They're very much accepted by Muslims as binding and the like. The example I gave is this in relation to women, for instance. This idea that this particular verse is saying "Al-Rijal Qawwamun 'ala an-Nisa," meaning depending on who you read, it can be men are in charge of women, or men are protectors and maintainers of women, or husbands should take good care of their wives. Whatever reading you take, there is an ethical, legal dimension to that. Meaning this is where you're sort of making a statement about the position of women, the legal, social, of women in the society. And there are lots of other things that are dependent on that particular understanding. So for me, this is a good example of an ethical, legal text. Also, the other, I mentioned the verses related to slavery, for instance. The Quran didn't prohibit slavery. The Quran actually, recognized that as an existing institution. It didn't encourage that. It existed at the time. It didn't prohibit that either. So texts that are related to slaves and slavery and whether that's acceptable, not acceptable, how that institution should function, these are all ethical, legal texts. Also, the texts that are dealing with, for instance, attitudes towards people of other faiths, whether Muslims should have this attitude of, enmity, or should have hatred towards them, or they should be friends with Muslims. These are all examples of ethical, legal texts. And similarly, the texts that are related to various issues related about, exploitation of weaker sections of the community, the lending money to people who are poor and then taking from them a lot more than what you lent. These are also examples of ethical legal texts.
What about inheritance?
Inheritance also would be part of that, yes. Inheritance also. It's a good question. A lot of Muslim scholars and thinkers have a rather difficult time with the issue of inheritance, because this is an area of law that is so clearly spelled out in the Quran. But I would argue that it's something that Muslim scholars need to look at, because the inheritance rules in the Quran is also based on a particular understanding of males, females, and their contribution to creation of wealth and society, who looks after whom. All these are actually at the heart of the inheritance debate. And I'm not sure what the practice in Malaysia like in some Muslim societies. Parents are very aware of the inheritance rules, and they somehow try to deal with that by giving their daughters, what would be roughly equivalent what their sons get. Yeah. Exactly, yes. So there are various strategies that are used, but they feel that if they strictly follow the rules, they're not doing perhaps the right thing. But obviously the Quranic inheritance rules came at a time when the society was quite different. So I'm not going to argue that we have to move away from the rules, but what I would say is this is an area that Muslim scholars and thinkers and jurists need to have a good look at. It is part of the ethical legal texts. It's a difficult one for a lot of Muslims because this is so clearly spelled out in the Quran. Now, you might ask, if something is so clearly spelled out in the Quran, is there room for Muslims to look at them slightly differently? Let me just give some examples from the very early period of Islam. Again, in the book I have a chapter on this. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh, the second Khalifa, had very interesting interpretations of certain Quranic verses which are very clear. Now, one example is something that's very well known in the tradition is the verse that deals with the distribution of zakat, or in Quranic terms, the sadaqat, innama sadaqatu lil fuqara'i wal masakin, that particular verse. There are 8 categories of people mentioned in that Quranic verse, and one of the category is al-mu'allafat qulubuhum. There are different interpretations of that, of what it means. But basically, during the Prophet ﷺ's time, there were certain people to whom a share of zakat was given, based on the Quranic verse. And after the Prophet's death, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh also gave them a share of zakat. And during Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh's time, these people came to collect the zakat, and he said, I'm not going to give you zakat. So, they said, how could you do that? The Quran says we should get it, the Prophet gave us that, Abu Bakr gave us that, and who are you to say that we shouldn't get that? And he said something very interesting. He said, in those days, Islam was weak, and we needed your support. Now Islam is strong, there's no need, basically to say, well, there's no need for us to give you zakat. Now this is so clearly spelled out in the Qur'an. And this is happening very soon after the death of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Context has changed. Now Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu is saying the context has changed, and therefore this doesn't apply anymore. Now he has a number of other such interpretations. Contextual difference. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu says, well, you come up with a different interpretation. That's just a few years after the death of the Prophet. Imagine, after 1400 years.
You mean the intention did not change? I mean, the reasoning of the verse did not change, but since this group no longer actually needs it, these are converts, people who come to Islam, and because now Islam is strong, they actually gain by coming to Islam, not lose, like the before. So the intention still remains the same, to help people who are in need.
Yeah,
so,
you can find other...
the whole idea is that the group is listed out to help people who are in need. But since they no longer are in need, but because they somehow still think that... yes, the context changed, but the intention's not changed. What to achieve is not changed.
That's one way of looking at that, because the other way of looking at that is a rather narrow reading of that particular category of people need to be broadened, maybe. Again, the category of jihad fi sabilillah is an important, interesting category. You expanded this whole category, and this is what Muslim scholars are doing.
You have the other example where Omar starts to tax on horses.
Yeah.
And before zakat was not paid on horses, now he introduces it because his argument was we needed horses to fight.
Yeah.
And so we encourage them to breed horses.
Exactly.
And now since horses are sufficient, we are going to, as a form of wealth, we will tax on horses.
That's right.
So this introduction is quite, whether income tax is zakat or not is another issue that we should discuss, right?
Yeah. That's right. There were different kinds of taxes in early Islam. Muslims paid something called zakat, and non-Muslims paid something else that's called jizya, and there were different kinds of taxes. And even on the issue of jizya, that's another example of an ethical legal text. The Quranic verse says, حَتَّى يُعْطُوا الْجِزْيَةَ عَنْ يَدٍ وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ. Again, this is the verse that is the basis of this whole institution of jizya. Now, some tribes in the second caliph's time, Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu's time, didn't want to pay jizya because they were supposed to pay jizya, but they felt jizya is kind of humiliating, and therefore they said, no, we don't want to pay jizya, but we are happy to pay what Muslims pay, but we pay double. And Umar said, well, I'll accept that. So here what you're seeing is someone who is so close to the Prophet ﷺ, who knew about Islam, who was with the beginning of Islam, was very aware of the intentions behind these texts. And he was quite prepared to put forward new interpretations when needed. During the Prophet ﷺ's time, and in some cases, an understanding was that when you conquer a particular place, the land could be distributed. And when Iraq was conquered, Umar ibn Khattab said, well, can't do that. This, if I distribute this to the soldiers, then what will be left to the Ummah? He said no. So again, he was not literalist. He was very aware of the context, the different needs of the community and the maslahah of the ummah and the like. And based on that, he was prepared to come up with interpretations. And also the famous case of the cutting of the hands. Yeah. And during the time of famine, he said, no, we can't have this. So here you see really contextual interpretations. So we're not coming up with something Western or American, Australian, or some foreign idea. It's there in our tradition. And if you go to various fuqaha and see they're thinking about a lot of the issues, their interpretations, very contextually relevant.
I've been reading some articles that there also exist certain verses which are not neither text or contextual, but they are more in the form of metaphor. Metaphor by definition is something like analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So could this be one of those factors that allows people to have some the space to interpret it liberally within inverted commas? The word liberal is very dangerous to use.
Just keep liberalism out. On the liberal
space to interpret it to the best of time. So, is there such a thing as a metaphor being used in the Quran? And to what extent there has been?
Again, there are big debates among Muslim scholars about whether there are metaphors in the Quran. Personally, for me, I see no reason why metaphors should not be used. In fact, the Quran uses metaphors quite a lot. That's the way language functions. Metaphors are part of language, whether it's Arabic, English, Malay, or whatever. We don't always use the literal meaning of the words we use. I mean, let me give an example. If I look at outside, this window and say, well, it is raining. One can take it very literally and say, well, it is raining. But that's not probably what I have meant. Because we were supposed to go somewhere, we were supposed to be there by 9 o'clock. And we all know that it has been raining for the last 2 hours. And what's the point of me saying it's raining? What I'm saying is, we are late or something, we won't get there. Because the words that are used or the literal meaning of that is not what is intended. Let me give an example from the Quran. There's a Quranic verse which says, حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمُ الْمَيْتَةُ وَالدَّمُ وَلَحْمُ الْخِنْزِيرِ and so forth. Basically it's saying, prohibited to you, dam means blood, maita means dead animal, and dam is blood and so forth. Is it a very clear Quranic verse? When you hear the translation, prohibited for you, the dead animal and blood and meat of the pig, is it clear? Are we sure? Okay. What exactly is prohibited? Let's take the animal that died of natural causes, maita. It says prohibited. What is prohibited? Help me understand. Touching it? Eating the meat? Making use of various bits of that? What exactly is prohibited? But the verse doesn't say that. The verse doesn't say that. It says prohibited. But we understand it as eating, isn't it? It's not what the verse says. It's an interpretation. It's an understanding. So this is why in the contextual approach, I argue that we have to be very mindful of this idea that language and meaning are very complex things. Most of us think that language is very simple. We use language all the time. We interpret all the time. We are interpretive beings. We see things, we interpret. We feel things, we interpret. We hear things, we interpret. We interpret the language, we interpret symbols all the time. That's something we do. We are very good at that. But language, the way we use that, is not that simple. Often we use words, we don't mean the literal meaning, we mean something else. So coming back to the question, do metaphors exist in the Quran? Yes. But there are Muslim scholars who actually said, no, there are no metaphors. There is a very long background to that, but I don't want to get into that. For me, metaphors are part of the language, and whatever language you speak, and in the Quran there are plenty of that.
The Quran is actually a divine revelation, the words of God.
Yes.
Meaning that those words are cast in stone. It's virtually like cast in stone. There's no two ways about it. But I do agree with you that language, shall I say, language text understanding evolve over time. For example, in the English language, if I want to say, please pay attention, but William Shakespeare would say, lend me your ears. There you are. So, I cannot see the relationship there where a language evolving and you compare that with a divine revelation in the Quran. There should not be any change there. There should not be any evolution of the language itself.
Nobody is saying that there is an evolution of the language. I mean, we are talking about keeping the Arabic text as it is, being as faithful to the basic linguistic meaning and the understanding of the grammar. We're not talking about evolution of the language. We're talking about understanding, interpretation. We are not playing games with the language. But then again, the idea that just because a text is revelation by God doesn't mean that it is not subject to the basic linguistic rules that we have, because it is in Arabic language. The Quran says this is a book in clear Arabic.
I know what you said just now. What is written is devoid of the what you call the sceneries, where you say the tone, the intonation, the background of it. When it's written in text, So it is text. But if you say openly, if you're an author, you write something and you say it out, people can see your body language, your facial expression, and then those add value to what you said. But in the Quran, it is something that is divine revelation. So there comes the, what shall I say, the care or the carefulness of people to, interpret it or what you call translate it in the way it should be.
Okay.
So I'm a bit, trying to be.
No, that's a good point. The thing is, sometimes we feel that because the Quran is God's word, because it's a revelation, then a lot of linguistic issues that we are talking about are not relevant to the Quran. But I don't think that's because yes, it is revelation. We believe it's a word of God. Yes, we believe it is the Quran. It's protected, all of that. But still, it is Arabic language. It's not me who say that. It's the Quran which is saying that this is a book that is in clear Arabic. So many Quranic verses, but the quality of the Arabic, the literary quality of the Arabic is just way beyond what ordinary people can actually, can manage. I mean, it's just way beyond that, because it has that. But it is still subject to all the rules, is subject to Arabic grammar, subject to, we study Arabic grammar to understand the Quran. We study Arabic rhetoric, that's balagha, to understand the Quran. Muslim scholars developed a whole range of disciplines, from literature to linguistics, to understand the Quran. And also pre-Islamic poetry was used very heavily to understand the Quranic text. So it is subject to all kinds of linguistic rules that we have, but it has this quality that it is such a high level of literary quality that ordinary people, don't have access to.
Yeah, I have some reflection in this sentence. You mentioned the word hurimat just now, where you basically said, what do you mean by prohibited in this sense? So that's one part of it. But what I'm more interested is when you mention about the cultural, the social part of it. What I'm interested now is more than anything, why the word khinzir is used in the Quran. There must be something about the culture in which how the Arabs think or depict of pigs that is rich enough that it doesn't have to be described in a long description of how the prohibition should be or what should you think of, but if you mention the word stay away from prohibition of something from the element of pig, for Arabs who read it, it makes sense completely. It's concise, that it captures the elements within just a few words. So I think that's the more than anything, the symbolism of what the Quran uses, and it's very strategic about it, that I think that can open how we reflect. So I think that's one reflection of mine.
Is it highly recommended that all of us Muslims should what they call try their best to learn Arabic, speak, write, and understand Arabic? What do you say about that?
For Muslims?
Yeah, for Muslims.
Well, the reality is the vast majority of Muslims today, roughly 80% of Muslims don't speak Arabic. And of the 20% that speak Arabic, well, depends whether they have got a good education in Arabic at the school level. Because the Arabic that is used in the Quran is what we might call al-Fusha, or that's not quite the dialect, not quite the Middle Arabic. It's the Fusha, and that's something that one has to learn, whether one is from an Arabic-speaking background or like me. Originally, I'm not from Arabic-speaking background, but I studied Arabic for many years. And in order to understand any text, in this case the Quran is in Arabic, and if one wants to master that, one has to learn Arabic. But that's not for everybody. Not all Muslims can understand or have the ability to, they don't have the time or the opportunity to learn Arabic. And as far as the Islam goes, it's perfectly fine. They have the basic beliefs, they do the basic practices, they are as committed to Islam like any other people, and I don't see any particular advantages of being an Arab in this regard. Most of the well-known scholars in early Islam were not necessarily Arabs. Imam Bukhari was not an Arab, Imam Muslim wasn't an Arab, and you can list so many of the theologians, linguists. Sibawayh wasn't an Arab.
That I agree.
Yeah. So, the biggest contributors to Islamic civilization were not necessarily Arabs. Again, the concept of Arab is also an interesting one. One can have a lot of debates on that. I'll leave it at that.
Since you raised the question, this is a little bit outside, but since you raised the question of context and you started with ISIS in the beginning, can we discuss a little bit about these misunderstandings? At least you consider them to be, the understanding to be very questionable. So, and then put it in a more positive context. Since the concept of Darul Islam and Darul Harb, instead now people are promoting the idea of citizenship rather than one against the other. Can we a little bit at least see how this fits in?
Again, this is an interesting concept, Darul Islam and Darul Harb. First of all, there is no mention of a Darul Islam or Darul Harb in the Quran. It's something that Muslims developed well after the Quran. It was a way of understanding, the world at the time. And again, there is another category called Darul Sulh, for instance, which is Darul Islam is supposed to be the domain where Islam was dominant. Islamic norms, laws were dominant, and Muslims had a dominant position. Darul Harb was supposed to be the enemy territory where Islam wasn't dominant, Islamic norms weren't dominant. So it's us versus them. And then the third category called Dar Sulh, which is the territory that is not Muslim but had a peace agreement with the Muslim. There are other categories, there are lots of other Dars, let's not worry about that. That's a way of understanding the world at the time. Worked for some time. Today, does it work for us? Today we live in modern states where all citizens are supposed to be equal. Citizenship is the key. If you're a citizen, whether you're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, whatever, is irrelevant. You're part of this society, an equal member of the society. Again, this concept of equality is something that's relatively modern. We may have elements of that in the tradition, but the kind of equality that we take for granted today is a very modern concept. Citizenship is a modern concept. Equality in the way we understand is a modern concept. And should we have a problem with that? No, we shouldn't have any problem with that. Society has changed. This is the way the world is. And maybe in future we might be seeing something very different. Maybe this citizenship closely connected to a modern state might not work in future. I don't know. But when the world changes, we also change the way we look at the world too. So these are categories that might be relevant for some time, might not be relevant for other times. And the kinds of things that, our context is so different. Just look at this concept of equality that we take for granted, whether it's men and women, Muslims and others, non-discrimination in all the forms that we have today. All these are very modern ideas. We might say, yes, we have, in our tradition, we have some of these ideas. Yes, we did. Human dignity is another example. Now, in the Quran, we have this very famous verse, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Indeed, one translation is, we honored the children of Adam, or we gave dignity to the children of Adam. There are different ways of translating that. But karrama is to karrama takrim, associated with the idea of giving dignity or honoring someone and the like. So one could say, well, look at the Quran. We have that a Quran that is coming from 1400 years back. We have this concept of human dignity. It's not just in the Quran, but also in other traditions we have that concept. But the reality is, the way we understand human dignity today, as we have in the Universal Declaration and basically in all other human rights documents, is a very modern idea.
I find it a bit interesting that you insist that these concepts are modern and there is no underlying universal essence to it, which is actually something that Prophet was very familiar with. Let's say the city of Medina.
Mm-hmm.
I guess everybody was some sort of equal citizen in the market, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about the foreign policy, yes, the ideas of Darul Harb and Darul Islam might have developed later, but not within society itself. You know what I mean? So these are different domains, different areas of expertise, and different terms. But to say that the concept of citizenship, of the concept of human dignity is something modern, I find it a bit interesting.
It's a modern, and I said in the way we understand it today.
Well, that goes back to the language and to historical context and to cultural context. So basically we have already understood that it has to be contextualized.
Yes.
Right?
Let's take the example that you gave, Medina Charter, for instance. This is, for those of you who are not familiar with Medina Charter, this is, some refer to as Constitution of Medina. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, migrated to Medina, one of the first things he did was, of course, apart from the mu'akha, having an agreement among various members of the Medinan community, Muslims versus Muslims, Muslims versus Jews. And when you read through the charter, you see that the Prophet did not have any clause in it which actually indicates that some people were inferior, some people were superior. There was no such thing. These were actually members of the Medinan community. But then look at what happened in the post-prophetic times. And Muslim scholars, looked at the situation at the time, developed ideas about, how you can become a member of the Muslim, of the Darul Islam. And here, the equality that you see in Medina Charter didn't exist. So if you're non-Muslim, you can be a member, but you just go to the Pact of Omar. Look at the rules that apply to non-Muslims.
Well, that's more empire.
How can we differentiate between a state, political organization, empire, and then society that's removed from that?
But I think you just have to go back to the historical context. Like you mentioned a very good example, how to differentiate between jizya and taxes. Some people take jizya as some discriminatory practice, but in fact it was just the terminology that differentiated two different ways of paying your due to the state, right? So again, you bring in the context and you understand that yes, the concept of citizenship was there, but of course it was a different historical context and different cultural context.
Citizenship was there, but it didn't exist the way we understand it today. I can't see any. In the pre-modern times, I'm just desperately trying to see whether in Muslim or non-Muslim context where the citizenship that we have now existed. Medina Charter, yes.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is basically a lot of those ideas that we take for granted today may have elements of that in our tradition, but not necessarily the way they are now. Because sometimes we have this habit of actually reading, projecting our ideas back to our tradition.
Yeah.
Now, we might say, jizya is just another text for a non-Muslim state. But you look at the literature on jizya, how the fuqaha actually conceptualized the jizya. There are two approaches among the fuqaha on the jizya. Some argue that jizya is for humiliation, very clearly spelled out.
But that is the problem with the scholar. It's not the problem with the practice when it was introduced.
You have to look at history. Yes.
Yeah.
History is
long. It's a long.
it's not ideal. History is never ideal. History is very practical. So the empire, the idea of empire and power plays a great role.
That's true. The point you're making is a very important one. That is, you may have a lot of these rules in fiqh, but in practice, how actually people dealt with is also quite different. By way of example, again, the Pact of Omar. When you read the Pact of, again, for those of you who are not familiar with Pact of Omar, these are a set of rules in relation to the treatment of non-Muslims in a Muslim state, attributed to Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, but there are historians who would say that that's not really it can't be attributed to Umar. It most likely could be attributed to Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. But regardless of that, when you go through the Pact of Umar, you will see all these rules that non-Muslims can't do this, can't do this, can't do that. They can't ride horses, they can't have houses. All these rules. Were they applied in practice in society? Yes, in some cases, yes. But in some cases, it didn't. People lived just like normal people, and the way we actually live today. But when certain problems emerge in society, there would be always push on the government to actually implement those rules. But imagine doing that in the modern period.
Discriminatory practices in modern states.
Of course they do.
In the name of X, Y, Z.
Yeah. I'm not saying our societies are perfect. What I'm saying is there are some concepts and that we some institutions, some ideas that we actually use, which are in the way we are doing that, it's very modern. So look at history of citizenship, history of the debate on human dignity and the like. And a lot of scholars would say, for instance, in many traditions there are concepts about human dignity. In Islamic tradition, in Christian tradition, in Jewish tradition, in Buddhist tradition, there are. But the way we actually talk about human dignity, the way it is expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 48 and the like, this is a modern concept. Human rights, is it a modern thing or an ancient thing? Well, elements of that existed in pretty much all traditions. We have a lot of them in our tradition. Just look at the rights that the Prophet emphasized in the early 7th century in relation to lots of categories of people. But the way we actually discuss human rights as as reflected in these documents in ICCPR and UDHR and many others is a modern discourse. It doesn't mean we don't have elements of that in our tradition. This idea of radical equality that we emphasize today, at least in theory, may not be in practice, at least in theory, that one should not discriminate against people based on their religion, sex, gender, and all of that. This is a relatively modern concept. But elements of that are there. Just look at the Qur'an, for instance. The reforms the Qur'an introduced in 7th century Arabian society. This is human rights. This is actually protection of people, various categories of people. So we have a lot of that in our tradition. But we shouldn't, personally, I'm very reluctant to actually say, well, we had all of this in our tradition and it's only these Western people, they're pretending that they actually, again, this is not about Western or Eastern. For me, a lot of these are actually
it's
common humanity, basically, yeah. There are reasons for the emergence of the human rights discourse in the modern period. But it has been developing for centuries. In Muslim tradition we have a lot of that. In Western tradition we have a lot of that. Philosophers and thinkers and scholars. But it is the context that actually forced people to actually shape some of these ideas.
Going back is fine, it's great. We need to understand the text, but we need to move forward also. So that's the problem. We need to a living Quran rather than a dead Quran.
That's right.
The ISIS formulation is either we recreate the situation before, which is rather silly, but it seems enticing to many Muslims. I'm surprised. Yes, there are very few people who are actually ISIS, but there are a large number of supporters of ISIS actually. At least almost envious of them. I'm shocked to see how Muslims idealize certain I cannot understand it.
ISIS emerged again in a particular context. The way they approached Islamic tradition, the way they actually chose bits of that tradition and tried to use that in the modern period completely went against the sense of fairness and relevance and even Islamicity of that in the modern period. And this is not just one person saying, oh, this is not acceptable. This is really the vast majority of Muslim scholars and theologians are saying ISIS was wrong in actually doing what they did. Even this whole issue of jizya from the Christians, they said, well, it's not relevant today. Is it fair for us to ask Christians in Malaysia to pay jizya, for instance? I don't think very many Malaysians would say, yes, it is fair. They would say, well, we all pay taxes, and that's the base, we are all citizens and we all pay taxes. Yes, the tax, some of us who are more wealthy than others would pay more taxes, but that's fair. That's our sense of being fair today. And the Qur'an is big on this idea of fairness and justice. It doesn't define what justice is, it doesn't define what fairness is, but it is always big on the idea of being just and being fair. And I have a feeling that the Qur'an is very aware of these different ways of being just and fair at different times. So it left it general. So our sense of fairness and justice today says to us, we can't discriminate against women because they happen to be women. We can't discriminate against men because they happen to be men. We can't discriminate against non-Muslims because they are non-Muslims. And we should treat all people as equal. But equality doesn't mean sameness. We all have different abilities, different skills, different, we are all different. Difference is a key part of us too. Our identity is based on difference too, not sameness.
Yes.
Because we are all different. Just imagine if we have, carbon copies of each other.
Well, within the Muslim societies, this idea of fairness doesn't translate.
Why?
The legal part translates.
How?
So the legal part seems to discriminate.
Yes. Very much, actually.
Seems to. I mean,
I'm trying to understand what
you can reinterpret the legal part, but either the idea of men is above women.
Oh, I see. In actual fact, okay.
Although the fairness, see, they see the actual text, the concrete text, as opposed to the ideological text. The idea of fairness is very vague, but the actual practice is here. So you will see. I mean, all the Muslims, whether they become, whether they can live in a modern society, also is another problem. This always going back to the past and glorious past somehow, and they don't seem to live in the moment. And they don't see, as you talk about, as I said, the Quranic ideas, the large ideas are all very fair. The idea of justice, treating people fairly, all these things. But in the details, the devil is in the details. And the detail seems to what do you call it? It trumps the bigger picture.
But then
so how do you make this a living Quran in a modern context?
Sense is overall, if you look at Muslims, there are Muslims and Muslims and Muslims. There are Muslims who would have difficulties with the sense of fairness that we may have, let's say, in Malaysian society about them. And the Quranic concept of fairness and justice is not necessarily articulated, defined. It's because the Quran was talking to living people, society. They had their sense of fairness and justice. But what's happening now is, in that society, certain things were taken as, or given, were accepted as fair and just. But because of the changes in society, structures and norms and values, when we come to the 21st century, in many of our societies, that understanding that may have existed then becomes problematic. Just take this issue of slavery, for instance. I mean, it was seen perfectly reasonable and fair to, have slaves. But the Prophet, actually, the Quran didn't encourage slavery, it discouraged slavery. The Prophet encouraged people to free slaves. The Quran encouraged that. But it didn't prohibit slavery as such. Maybe it couldn't have prohibited that, and maybe it wasn't too too practical. Whatever the reason, we don't know what the reason is. Slavery became part and parcel of Muslim history. It was only in the 1960s in Saudi Arabia slaves were freed. And then again we have modern forms of slavery. So slaves haven't disappeared. There are millions of women who are trafficked in, kids. All kinds of slavery exists today. But at least the way we used to have slaves, people selling other human beings in slave markets, is no longer part of our values. If ISIS wants to revive that, my sense is the vast majority of Muslims wouldn't or don't go along with that. This simplistic vision of Islam as, 1, 2, 3, 4, you follow these, you become the good Muslim, or this is how Islam was practiced at during the Prophet's time, as ISIS wanted to project, it's too simplistic. Because, that's not the Prophet's way. It was the Prophet actually going around, killing people, destroying them, and shooting people. You did something that you get shot in the market. Is it how Muslim societies function? I don't think Muslim societies ever function in that way. So this ISIS idea that, this is how Islam should be practiced, is just something that most Muslims would find very offensive. Yes, there are people who are sympathetic to that for all kinds of reasons, but our sensibilities don't go along with that.
Mutations of your eyes all
it's these, throughout Muslim history, we had people going in all kinds of ways claiming that, they are the true followers of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
I don't want to dominate, but let me just clarify. Since yesterday or today, there came out an article in the newspaper saying that child marriages must be allowed.
Sorry? Child
marriages must be allowed.
Necessary.
It's necessary for
Kelantan.
of all states.
Oh my goodness.
So look, they keep pointing to Aisha. And then they don't talk about the rights of the woman actually having her rights over her own body, deciding whether to marry or not. It's the parents. These are the concrete things that become problems with their bigger ideal. How do you resolve it? They seem silly maybe in an Australian context, but they're actually happening in Malaysia.
See, the thing is, people say, well, look at, again, this is a good example of an ethical legal text related to marriage, for instance. Do Muslims have the ability to come up with different ways of managing marriage in a society? If you ask maybe someone like Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, maybe he would say, oh yes. If you look at his decisions,
I'm actually surprised how he got away with all these decisions.
Because he was very reasonable.
A person who did it would never have got away with it.
The people whom he was talking to were actually senior Sahaba and companions, and they all understood what the Quran was all about. And many of us today pretend that we understand the Quran. We have very little understanding of the history, how the tradition developed, how Muslim scholars thought about these issues. We have a vague idea of things, and we think that we know everything. And we know very little, really. Now, coming back to this issue of child marriage, it's an interesting one. Yes, in that culture, in the Arabian society, and in fact, until relatively recently, even in European societies, it wasn't an issue. The concept of child, again, this is another thing, that the way we use it is a very modern concept. Child, as defined in various documents, is actually one who is under 18. This has no relevance to how, various other traditions thought about a child. The concept of the child, as the way we use it, is a modern construct. But most of us, most states around the world, have taken that, because that's part of our understanding of what a child is. So the question is, just because this practice existed in earlier times, even in the Prophet's time, does it mean that we have to follow that? Is there a requirement in Islam that as Muslims we must have child marriage in our societies? There's no such thing. Public interest, maslahah may demand that we shouldn't have child marriage. And there's nothing in the Qur'an or the Sunnah that says part of one of the key characteristics of a Muslim is having being a subscriber to this idea of child marriage, and one should have 4 wives. There's no such thing. Yes, these institutions may have been important in earlier times, but in the modern period, states have on behalf of the community to develop ideas to take things in a different way. A key characteristic of being a Muslim is that we believe in one God. We have these basic beliefs, practices, institutions. We must follow that. Apart from that, we have lots of freedom to think about creatively about society, managing society. The whole issue of maslahah is a big thing in Islamic tradition. And in fact, if you look at Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu anhu's decisions, a lot of it is based on maslahah. Common interest, common benefit, public interest. It's a big thing. In the name of public interest, there are lots of things the state can do. Marriage. Until relatively recently, there was no requirement to register a marriage anywhere. Even today, people actually play games with that. You have a registered marriage, then you have private religious marriage, and you have this. People play games, but the state can actually introduce rules about this. At what age can you marry? Well, it can be 18. Public interest. There's nothing in Islam that says you must marry by the age of 18, by the age of 13 or 12 or 9.
It's just like polygamy, right? There's some countries like Tunisia that the ulama prohibits for the sake of maslahah.
Polygamy is another example. A lot of men would say it's a man's right to have 4 wives. But where is in the Quran? I mean, even the verse that says, Mathna wa thulatha wa ruba', is this verse actually saying that as a Muslim man you must have 2 wives, 3 wives, 4 wives? No, it's dealing with a particular situation where there was no social security. There are lots of people who are left behind. Who's going to look after these people, these families? Marry them. Or there are orphans that need to be looked after. Don't deal unjustly with them. The Quran is big on this issue of justice and fairness when it comes to marriage and divorce. Just look at all the Quranic verses. It's about justice and fairness, mostly to women, because they were actually discriminated against. They're vulnerable, and the Quran is protecting them. Orphans, vulnerable, the Quran is protecting them. And we kind of lost track of the purpose behind these, and men have taken this as a kind of license, to marry.
This is problem with Faqih, because they deal with the actual details. There's no big picture. Now when you talk to people who study faith, they say, we don't want to study usul faith, we want to study faith.
But how can you study fiqh? How can you study fiqh without usul? And the usul also.
Usul is difficult.
But
it's like law and jurisprudence.
But without jurisprudence, there is. I mean, how can you sort of?
You talk to lawyers. No, just tell us what to do. We'll implement it. Don't ask us how we reach it here. So but you said we talk about justice and equality and equity. This strongly emphasizing. Totally forgotten. In many cases, totally forgotten.
But this is the problem. See, people think that that you just follow this rule, that rule, and that rule, and that's sufficient. Maybe that's sufficient for some people. But how what we call Islamic law developed is interesting. It's actually based on principles, based on ideas, and most of us probably don't have any idea of those principles. But you can't actually have a functioning system of law without good foundations. We do have very good foundations in Islamic law. It's not that we have that. But the problem is, in our education system, in our training of the next generation of religious leaders, we are not paying attention to lots of these issues. You know, we graduate so many people with, having a bachelor's degree in fiqh or tafsir is just a starting point. Even having a PhD in that area is just a starting point. We need to go well beyond that. We need to strengthen our education system so that, you know, our religious leaders, theologians, scholars are better prepared. I think we need to approach the issue of usul fiqh in a bit more sophisticated and creative way. We have, see, our tradition is very rich in this stuff. You look at any discipline, linguistics, usul fiqh, you know, tafsir, we have very rich traditions. But many of us are not very familiar with our traditions. That's a big problem. By many, I don't mean average person. I mean
Many, I agree, many.
scholars and students of Islamic studies. So our education system needs a lot more work, I think.
There's a verse, I can't remember, but like for men who fast and for women who fast, for men who fast, yeah. That was used, the ayah was used as a basis for equality and justice because of the same text. Okay. However, in another verse, there is like women are taken like half of their value in terms of witness or something. Is there differences in social, cultural, political context? Equality, yeah.
That's a very good point.
Justice, yeah.
See, if you look at that particular, as you mentioned, it goes on to, you know, males who do this, people, women were asking the Prophet ﷺ, you know, where are we? I mean, the Quran talks about men, and the verse says, well, if you do this, whether you're a man or a woman, you will get reward. But then again, this is a society in which women didn't have the same in general. I mean, you look at the Prophet ﷺ's wife, Khadija. She was a businesswoman. She was helping the Prophet. She was very strong. She was independent. She was all of that. You know, but it might not be the general, picture that emerged from the society. So women did have a lot of disadvantages in general. Even to the extent, even when the inheritance verse was revealed, there were some companions who were very concerned about that. Said, well, how can women get this? They felt it was unfair for girls to have a share because, you know, that's not how it should be. They don't generate wealth. You know, they marry somebody else and they go somewhere else. So the wealth is gone. So basically, they felt it was unfair to give, females a share of inheritance. Their sense of fairness, they're difficult in understanding that. But it wasn't complete equality, but it actually gave a lot of, support for females. Coming to this verse that actually talks about the issue of women's, testimony being half. See, if you read that verse very carefully, you will find that this verse is in the context of some commercial transactions. When you have debts, when you document, the Quran says, in order to avoid disputes, when you actually lend, document that and find witnesses. If you have two men, fine. If you can't find two men, then find one man and two women. And if one forgets, the other could remind her, what is going on here? In that society, this is a men's society. Men actually played most important roles in that society. And women did not really, by and large, it's not their world. So one way to read the verse is, the Quran is actually saying to Muslim community, have some confidence in women. Yes, even though they are not generally speaking involved in these kinds of things, at least have two women if one forgets, because this is not something they do on a day-to-day basis. Easy to forget. If this is part of your job, you don't. It's not, I read that as not discouragement, I read that as giving confidence, saying that have some confidence in women, although this is not an area they actually do on a day-to-day basis. If you can't find two men, just find one man and two women. If the one woman forgets, the other will remind her. Why do you forget? Because this is not something that you do on a day-to-day basis. If this is part of our job, how do we forget? We can't, isn't it? Now that's one reading of the verse. That reading doesn't contradict other verses in the Quran, because in many cases the Quran seems to give this idea that men and women, by and large, they are on the same level playing field. You pray, you give sadaqah, you fast, you're man or woman, you all get reward. No distinction at all. But then again, if you read some other Quranic verses, you get this idea that the one I mentioned, Ar-Rijal Qawwamun ala Nisa, and then in other verses, وَلِلْ رِجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةً. Men have this bit of degree over them. What does it mean? You can actually relate to how things were in that society. Obviously, it was a fact that men had more advantages, more power, and all of that. Does it mean that the Quran is saying that forever in all Muslim societies this is how the society should be? No, it's not actually saying that. It doesn't say. It is maybe making an observation about what exists then. But Muslim scholars have read this in a different way. Why they read it this way? Because the context was such that they just the normal way of reading for them.
I thought the context was supposed to be like the husband has higher, because it's in the context of divorce, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That the husband has more rights than for rujuk than other men. That was the context actually. See,
I mean, that's a slightly different context. But this particular verse about testimony is not about that. It's more about these commercial transactions having. But then again, Muslim scholars by and large said, well, what does it mean? This means basically, does it mean that one man equals two women? Mm-hmm. In this type of case, or in general? And a lot of Muslim scholars went all the way. So they're actually using something that exists in the Quran and generalizing that to a whole range of different areas. But why they're making a mistake? I would say no. For them, their societies were like that. So it was very normal for them to think like that. But what about our societies? Do we have any evidence to suggest that women are intellectually inferior? We have no evidence. There is no evidence whatsoever. Women are incapable of doing X, Y, Z that men do. No evidence. Business. We have women running countries, big companies, universities, and there is no evidence that these are failing. So basically, but if you look at Razi, for example, by way of example, and look at Razi's commentary on this verse and how he actually sees women. It's not just Razi's, many other scholars said, women are weaker, women are this, there are no prophets among women because they are, they're intellectually inferior, there are all kinds of ideas about women in our tradition. But that's how societies work. But do we accept these things?
I disagree. I don't think our traditional societies, exactly like what you said earlier, we project our own current expectations and current beliefs to the historical past. I think that a lot of our traditional societies were much more egalitarian, speaking, than what we are today. In fact, if I look at a lot of Muslim cultures today, they can't be compared with what Muslim societies were 800 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and closer going back to the times of Prophet, Medina State, Umar, and all that. I think it's an illusion when we think that our societies in the past we're actually subscribing to this kind of mentality. You know, it's, yes, you have the descriptive part and prescriptive part, and we make that kind of mistake all the time. But it's a mistake to think that, well, okay, we waited all the way to see how the Western women are doing and how they are succeeding for us to learn a lesson and to start reading these verses in sort of observative, you know, descriptive way. You know what I mean? So because when we discuss this, so much time has passed that we always get this fallacious thinking that, yes, our societies were like that and now we start changing. This is really a very big error, or it's a big way, it's a big wrong way to read what has happened in the past 1,000 years and so on.
That's a very good point. But the thing is, we actually talk about not exactly how the societies were, but we actually talk about rules, interpretation. Just look at the fiqh tradition as an expression of, there's a big debate among scholars about whether fiqh, the rules, actually reflect what was happening in society or not.
And I don't think it actually reflects at all.
What happens on the ground among people, men and women, you know, Muslims, non-Muslims, may well be very, very different.
Absolutely. And you know what? I think the situation is pretty much the same today, because when you listen to our fuqaha and our scholars, Muslim scholars, speak about different issues, it's disgusting what they say it should be and how Islam it should be, and like, you know, this kind of ISIS pathetic ideas. But when you look at how Muslim people, normal Muslim people live, and their belief system and their practical, you know, ways of living, it's just absolutely normal and it's very reasonable. So now imagine somebody reads some of our today's Kalanta and Fuqaha discussions 300 years, you know, from today. They would think Malaysia was like nuts like that. You know, it's just, this is the way that we are projecting our today's erroneous beliefs about our past.
You see, your point about what happens on the ground is very, very relevant. But you know, when you look at the fiqh, the rules, you know, these are very evident. I mean, throughout the writings of fuqaha for the last 1400 years, we see a lot of this.
They are evident, but they are distorted the way that they are reaching to us, because there is a lot of Muslim women to whom we are not having access today. And we, for some reasons, whatever discrimination has happened during the scholarship dominion, this text, these contributions are not reaching to us today. So we keep going back to the same sources, which are discussing very much male-centric concepts or how they view society.
That's what we are talking about. Most of the scholars who actually read this are men. And what I'm saying is, when they read these in this way, that's very natural for them, because that's how the society by and large was. I mean, the fact that there were Muslims who were living slightly differently or who had different practices in different societies, and that's very visible. I mean, even if you look at Muslim non-Muslim relations, let's say 50 years back in a village in Malaysia, you probably will find that Muslims and Christians and everybody else sharing everything. There's no sense of superiority or inferiority. This is what's visible in many societies. You go to Iraq, you go to you know, Egypt, you go to various other countries, you see very similar things. So the fact that various societies functioned very differently, quite different to what the fiqh actually would show, is something that we all recognize. I don't think there's an issue with that. But what I'm saying is, in the modern period, particularly, you know, when we say how Islam should be and what kind of practices we should be, people are going back to fiqh and these rulings and say, well, we had this. There was this interesting fatwa by some person in Egypt who said, well, in order to, in the context of, you know, some, you know, how some males should be within the family, he said, well, let's breastfeed her. I mean, breastfeeding is supposed to, you know, make one, you know, a part of family. But how do you sort of breastfeed an adult? I mean, it's ridiculous. But there are people who have this. But where do they get this? Yeah. This is coming from.
That's a big question, actually.
From
only this kind of very close-minded institutions who have lost have lost connection to reality.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
have lost connection to the life, the current, trends of how Muslims are facing today. It's just.
They're looking at some rules. They say, there's a rule here. The rule there. Let's follow that. I mean, this child marriage is just yet another example of that.
But I would like to say one more thing. I'm very, very strongly convinced that the way that also the fiqh rules developed and the way that fiqh rules developed at our early Muslim history, actually it was not driven by ideas and principles, it was driven by reality. It was simply a response, a timely response to the needs and challenges that society was facing.
It was based on practicalities rather than ideals.
Exactly. So it was not driven based on illusions or based on any kind of utopian concept. People face a problem, they go back, dig out the text, and come up with a rule to help the people. So the whole idea was how to help people have a better life. How Islam has become today, totally the contrary of that. Totally the contrary of that.
That's how, when you look at first century, second century in Muslim societies, when fiqh was being developed, that's how the fiqh developed. Fiqh developed not based on some wonderful set of ideas. It was based on the practice. Practice of the people of Madinah. Just look at the Maliki Mazhab, the practice of people, and also in Iraq, the Fuqaha would say, this is how we do things in our society. So it's very much based on what people used to do things. This whole notion of urf is very important part of that too. So that's how it developed. But once it developed, then many of us, for many centuries, thought, okay, let's follow the rules. And today we have been far more removed.
It's sacred.
Yeah, the whole thing becomes sacred. But what is sacred about that?
The connection with the reality that is lost. Today,
Exactly.
I find much more happiness to sit and listen to Jordan Peterson because he has so much more substance to give, even though he's like far right probably, and he's got a lot of ideas wrong, but he talks about life, he talks about challenges that any citizen of the globe today is facing, and he gives a lot of value. So imagine, I would rather sit and listen to him than open a video and listen to a fuqaha from Middle East, because the fuqaha from Middle East talks about thousands of years ago, which to me it's like, I don't have anything to do with it.
Yeah. See, religion is part of society, part of life. When what we call religion, again defined in rather liberally, becomes just ideas, rules, values that have no relevance.
Something to be avoided.
Yeah.
Becomes something to be avoided.
Then you should avoid that. I mean, in fact, that's what is happening. A lot of people are actually moving away from religion. Just look at the figures. It's amazing. I'm not sure what the figures for Malaysia is like. For Australia, every census, we have census every 5 years, and the percentage of Australians who say they don't belong to a religion, they don't believe in a God, is increasing. I think it's close to 20% now. In a country like UK, it's over 50%. And I'm sure in Muslim societies there are lots of people who don't believe in religion, but they don't say that. Because when religion becomes irrelevant, what's the point?
Exactly. It's not helping
Religion
anything.
has to be relevant. This is the stuff that we are talking about are actually real life issues. If we can't find answers to that in our most sacred texts, then what are we going to do? I mean, this whole approach, contextualist approach, is one way of actually engaging with the text, real life. This is where the current context becomes so important.
And I think that we thank Dr. Abdullah Said again for engaging us in this wonderful discussion, a very timely discussion actually, considering what's happening in our society today. We will end our discussion today with Surah Al-As and Tasbih Kafarah.